I had this really come to light to me one time. Elizabeth and I have some very close friends whose wife, husband and wife, they were a little older than us. She got very ill in her 40s and died in her early 50s. And she was buried here at the cemetery in Boca Raton. And if you're familiar with the cemetery in Boca Raton, it's like our church on both sides of 4th Avenue. There's a west side and an east side. On the west side, you're allowed to have monuments, vertical monuments and gravestones and tombstones. On the east side, they have to be on the ground horizontal. You can have nothing vertical on the east side. Well, there were no plots available on the west side, and he wanted to buy plots for he and his children, so he bought 10 on the east side. A very godly man, and he was not given much to rules at the time, and so he decided to build a cross on the tomb of his wife. And he built this beautiful cross, not made of marble or stone, but of wood and of flowers, artificial flowers, beautiful holly flowers, and he put that right on it, and the cemetery, the city said, "Take it down." He said, "I'm not taking it down." They said, "Take it down." Not taking it down. Letters flew, attorneys writing to each other. He said, "I'm not taking it down." And he's a very godly man, but somewhat obstinate, as you could tell. He said, "I'm not taking it down." And they said, "We're going to sue you." And he goes, "Come on." And they sued him. And then it went to court, and he lost. And then it went to appellate court. And then it went to the Supreme Court of the state of Florida, of which they did not listen to it. But while it was at the appellate, between the appellate and the Supreme Court and all the things going on, there was an attorney in West Palm who said he would take the case pro bono. You know what pro bono is, right? Free. So our friend asked if I would go to meet with the attorney and him one day, and so I did. So we got up there to West Palm, and sitting there was our friend, myself, and it turned out there were 3 other people who had vertical displays. So there were 4 people being sued. I wasn't aware of all this because I hadn't followed the suit. 4 people being sued by the city of Boca and all these things, and there's attorneys everywhere. And this man's attorney, working for free, sat on this side of me. As I entered into the conference room, you know, attorneys love to have all their displays and their photos, I realized I was not in friendly territory. This man was a very ungodly man. I could tell, you know, you can tell people by their associations. So I wasn't judging him. I was just realizing that I was in a place that I had never been before. He was one of the lead attorneys for the ACLU. And so, if you don't know who that is, I don't tend to agree with them usually. And so we're there, and we're having all this discussion. And all of a sudden, there was a quiet. They were copying papers or something. Everybody was quiet. So I was talking to the attorney. Now, here is a man, a godly man in his 60s, who I knew very well. And he's talking to the people down at this end. And I have an opportunity to talk to this gentleman. And I said to him, "What do you think about all this?" He goes, "I think it is foolishness." I said, "Do you believe in the cross of Christ?" He says, "Absolutely not. It is foolishness." I said, "Then why are you taking this case?" He said, "Because I believe in religious freedom." We'll put that one aside. And I sat there and talked to him, and I said, "Why do you believe it is foolishness?" And he said, in not these exact words, but he said, "Think about it. A man 2,000 years ago was crucified on a piece of wood, on a nondescript hill, a hill that even Christians argue where it is. I was there this summer, and we argue whether it's over here to the west of the city or over there to the north of the city. We don't even know exactly where the hill was. We think we know where the hill is." He said, in a nondescript hill, in a nondescript city. Think about it. Jerusalem. Not in Egypt, not in Syria, not in Babylon, not in Persia, not in Athens, not in Rome, not in the great places of the world. He was in the backwaters of that culture, on the very edge of it. And then to think that that one little act will change the course of history is ludicrous. The people came back in, we started talking, and the case went on. Mediation and different things going on. This man over here, though, believed that the work of Christ on the cross is the power of God. Now, both of them were smart. Both of them were higher educated than the average. Both of them were wealthier than the average. Both of them were articulate. Both of them kind of came out of the same background. Both of them were about the same age. Everything about these two men was the same, except one thought that the cross of Christ was foolishness, and the other thought it is the power of God. And if you want to know the truth, that is where this whole thing of Christianity cuts to the core. We can talk about a lot of things. Do you come out of this background? We can argue with this, and we can argue with that, and some of you are Presbyterian, some of you are Baptist, some of you are Catholic, some of you are Greek Orthodox, we can argue and argue and argue and argue. But the reality is this: do you believe that what we just sang about and what Elizabeth just read about is true, or do you not? We can argue all the other things, and it's fun to argue, but that is the core of this whole storyline. There's nothing in between. But wait, you say, wait a minute, there is something in between. Well, what's in between? Let's say here's the foolish guy, or the one, not the one who says it is foolishness, I'll put it that way. And here's the one who says it's the power of God over here. Is there not middle ground? Could we not take a little from both? And that is the place that many people who call themselves Christians sit. They sit right in the middle. And what is the middle ground? The middle ground is this: that I believe, and I'll just take this person's belief for a moment. I don't believe it. I sit over here, not here. But the person who is here would say, what Christ has done is good. He was a good teacher. He was a good man. He did some good things. And what is not to like about what Christ did? And I would say you're exactly right. What did Christ do? He did some great sermons that told us to love our enemy as ourselves, sermons that told us to love our neighbor as ourselves, sermons that told us that we should treat others like we want others to treat us. What's not to like about that? He also said things like, it is better to give than to receive. What's not to like about that? All these great things. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, most of it you could just love, because even when he talked about building on the solid ground or building on the sand, well, that makes sense. All these sermons that Jesus said made sense. That's if you only listen to the big sermons. But if you start listening to what Jesus said, Jesus also said that there is only one way to heaven. There is only one way to the Father. Do you remember him saying that? He said there's one path, and I am the way to that path. He said there is only one door, and I am the door. If you want to enter into heaven, you got to enter that way. So the point of it is this: you cannot stand here and say Jesus was a good teacher. Because if you do, you got to take his whole teaching right. And C.S. Lewis was excellent when he said these words. He said, Jesus was not just a good teacher. If he was, then he was a liar. Because if he is not God, if he is not the Savior of the world, if the crucifixion doesn't mean that much, if you want to take the verse in John 10:10 that says, because he lives, we too shall live, and leave out the death and the burial side, what you forget is that right after that, he says that he is the door to heaven. He is the door to the Father. So you can't take verses out here and then verses out here and then verses over here, because he's one of two things if you do that. Number one, C.S. Lewis would say he's a liar. In other words, he knew he was not the Lord, so he just said those things to help himself be boosted up. Well, doing that is called lying, right? If you're a liar, you're not a good teacher, correct? And he has gone against what he would believe. But then you could say, well, he's not a liar. Calling Jesus a liar is a little over extreme. Even the people that don't believe him don't call him a liar. Then what is he? C.S. Lewis would say he's a lunatic. Why? Because maybe he actually believed what he said. If he believed what he said and it was not true, he was deceiving himself. So C.S. Lewis, when he wrote his book Mere Christianity about 60 years ago, and if you've never read that book, you should read it, especially those of you who are skeptical, that are sitting somewhere in this group here. He said either he is a liar, or he is a lunatic, or he is what? He is actually the Lord. Actually, when he died on that piece of wood, on that nondescript hill in that nondescript city, that God was redeeming the entire world. Now, the reason we don't always take this well is because if I were doing it, and if you were doing it, you would not do it in Jerusalem. I've been all over the world. There are some beautiful parts of the world, gorgeous parts of the world. If I was God and I said, I want to send my son, you know where I would have sent him to? Like Switzerland. Or maybe southern Norway, or to one of the islands in the Caribbean. There's some beautiful places in this world. But have you ever been to Jerusalem? Think of Jerusalem without air conditioning. Think of Jerusalem without climate control. Think of Jerusalem without clean water, purified water. Think of Jerusalem without approved food. And all of a sudden, Jerusalem's a pretty tough place. This is not the place I would come to save the world if I wanted to set up what I was doing. And that's why it looks foolishness to some, but to those who believe it is the power of God.